Well, welcome to Connections 2021 Working Group 3 Outbrief Gaming the Irrational. I'm Ed McGrady. I design games, and my co-producer here for the working group is Justin Peachy, who I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Yeah, Justin Peachy. I'm a research scientist at CNA on our wargaming program. I also design games and run wargaming projects. So, Ed, if we want to, do we want to share our slides here? I
There
think.
we go,
Thank
right
you.
there.
Awesome. Gaming the Irrational was the topic of our working group. We've been working this kind of on and off since the beginning of the calendar year. That prior to the conference, we had multiple people submit papers. And then we had a discussion yesterday for, I think, about an hour and a half or 2 hours, kind of talking about how we might go about gaming the irrational and why that's important. So let's go ahead and move slides. There we go. So this actually was one of the first things that we discussed. And I think every single one of our papers provide a definition. Now, what do we mean by irrational? This is a question that we got some pushback yesterday. So we're going to note two different things that we mean. So the first is the economic and logical proposition, where we're basically talking about violating some set of axioms or a utility function that we're aiming for. That's probably the more formal definition. But the second thing that we really see and wanted to get after is how do we just involve the unexpected, the crazy, the silly or disruptive types of decisions that we might want in our games. So there are ways to do this. Some ways may be unethical or at least less ethical, where we manipulate the players, stressing OODA loops, giving them a shorter amount of time. I think one person in our working group noted, well, we could deprive them of food and drink. That type of thing tends to lead to poorer decision making. The other definition is a little harder to include in our games. By definition, the unexpected is unexpected, and trying to include that means that I need to have probably either those people in the game or have thought really hard. And some of those examples are things like media pressure, which we see all the time, politics and politicians, which would, as we know, never, ever affect defense spending, ever, or panic and morale. So having said that we have two different potential ways of thinking about this, let's talk a little bit. So I'll ask Ed to move slides of why it's important that we do this. And the first thing that I think all of us established in our discussion yesterday is we do not do a good job of this in our games. We don't do this in our models and simulations either. I know I've spent plenty of time, and I'm sure Ed has as well, and the wargaming community writ large, criticizing ourselves for not being accurate in our games. For me, that often means that I'm trying to cut stuff out, so I really get the players to focus on what I want them to focus on, but that is actually affecting our accuracy of our games, specifically because I'm often cutting out the silly, the Twitter, the some of the other stuff that I didn't expect. So we spent a while discussing kind of examples in which this might come up. So procurement and acquisition games don't include either congressional or other potentially realistic behaviors in the game. Everybody has their funding source they want to protect, etc. Sure, we can build that into our rules somewhat, but we don't really get the mirror to the real world that we would hope. We don't duplicate a lot of our accidents. Those things occur. Yes, they're black swans sometimes. They're hard to predict, but we don't really make an attempt to include those. And often that's because we want to focus on a specific outcome. But these black swan or unexpected events have major effects on many of our outcomes, and we're just sweeping them under the rug. As I already kind of alluded to, things like media and social media don't play in our games, or if they do, it's kind of thrown into, hey, we do these things in a diplomatic sense, or in our tactical games, maybe an enlisted person puts something on social media, but that's the extent of it, and it doesn't really greatly affect what we're after or how our play progresses. In politics, I tell you what, if you figure out a way to involve politics for impactful play in game, short of something like, say, a secret Hitler, I'd love to hear it, because we really do need to include more of that. That has an effect on at least DoD wargaming, but it's often just part of either the backstory or the road to war, and then it doesn't really matter. Legal and criminal issues. So I'm gonna pick on Ed here and say we talked some about things like Abu Ghraib yesterday. Hey, when's the last time we represented something like that in our games? And if you did include it, when's the last time you had your players accept that might occur? And finally, emotions and attachment. A couple of the participants in the working group or the workshop yesterday noted that, if you can build that emotional attachment to your units, that's great. That's what happens in the real world, but that takes a lot of work. And so often it's just chits we're moving around the map. So, okay, next slide. So we spent a while in the 4 papers that we have, and then in the workshop yesterday, saying, how do we include it in games? And we kind of broke things out into 2 buckets. So the first bucket was the things that are hard. So things like media or politicians that don't behave the way we would expect, Congress, emotions, those are often hard to include in our games. And some of the papers that we're going to continue to work on highlight, maybe one way to do that is to go straight to the source and pull in media members to play the media. To pull in crazy politicians or members of Congress, that's a little harder, but that would be great. The problem is, even if we pull those people in, they may just go with the narrative or the storyline we've built in the game and not act the way they might in the real world. Those are hard. Some things are not quite so hard. There are mechanics out there for representing panic and morale. Whether we use them sufficiently is a different question, but there are rules that we could leverage for that. We could do things like an OODA loop disruption or mess with the player's decision abilities and cycles. And you can do that explicitly with something like an imposition of time limitations. As I mentioned earlier, one of our workshop members yesterday suggested, well, we could deprive people of food and drink. No, any scarcity can get after this OODA loop disruption. And in general, many of the things we do in our tactical games try to capture this at the unit level. We just don't necessarily see this move to the operational or strategic level. So next slide, Ed. So very broadly, because I'm running low on time here, and I want to leave some time for questions, a couple conclusions. This is hard, and our games are inaccurate because of that. So are our models, so are our simulations. We're generally good with that, but it's really insufficient moving forward. So we need to think harder about what we exclude and what we include. And it's especially important in our training games. And it's important in training games because we train people to operate in a pristine environment where everything works perfectly, when we know that's not going to happen in the real world. And similarly, when we talk about high-level strategic games, tactical actions that don't feed our strategic goals or narratives almost always occur and almost always swept under the rug or not included in our games. If we want to get after being more accurate with how the real world works in our games, we need to include these types of things. Similarly, we need to think about how to deal with the strange events. So it might not be irrational, but they're definitely strange. And these occur all the time, but have low individual probability. It goes back to what do we include in the game versus exclude, because some of these things can drive the whole game and players could go down a rabbit hole we don't want them to go down. But if we don't include them at all, we don't have a plausible game set. So really what this means, at least when I think about my day-to-day job, is I need to figure out how to convince the players, my sponsors, and particularly the critics to allow us to include some of these events in the game. I need the buy-in to be able to play the game. But I'm not getting that if I include lots of these strange things. And so I need to walk that fine line. And with that, I'm going to open it for questions. And while we take questions, I just want to note, what are our next steps? So you can still visit the website for the working group there and participate in discussion. The papers have been submitted and placed in the Google Drive. If you need access, go ahead and either visit the Google Drive or email Ed or myself. And finally, we have a concept board that we used yesterday for our discussions that you are free to visit and see some of the other ideas in more detail that I wasn't able to cover in the 10 minutes that I was talking here.
And I'll put a link to the concept board in the Discord chat as soon as I come up.
So with that, I hear no questions right now. Do we have any thoughts that I missed there, Ed? Since I'm sure you have some thoughts that I was unable to get to.
Yeah, I think that the thing I would hit on is the idea that we constantly are criticizing ourselves for not being accurate. We is our probabilities right? Is our PKs right? Do we have the right models? Are the models right? We're constantly asking ourselves those. But when someone brings up some of these other topics that are massively inaccurate if they're left out of games, we're good with it. So, for example, procurement and acquisition games. If I'm a program manager and I want to understand how my system's going to evolve through the program process, you'd think that Congress might get a vote on that. Oh, wait, they do, but we never include them. And we don't include them for a very good reason, which is if they found out, they would be extremely unhappy. But that is a massive, much more overwhelming error in our games than having the wrong PK or not characterizing something correctly or not having the right set of players. I think we do have a question now.
Yeah. Before we get to the question, I just briefly wanted to follow up. It's also, I don't want to say easier, but we get a double check when we go to modeling and sim and we talk about PK there. But the fact that we don't include Congress in the simulation either, joking here, but seriously, means that we're missing it doubly. We don't have the backup. And I think someone brought this up yesterday in our discussion. I just don't remember who.
So the question is, can we learn to be deliberately irrational in a way that baffles the enemy and achieves our mission? I'm not really clear that we are not deliberately irrational, and that training people to be more irrational would achieve much other than making us more chaotic in our operations. But I'll turn it over to Justin for that.
No, I think that's actually a great response, Ed. And I don't have much to add because I'm not convinced. I mean, I think there are whole books written about this on U.S. foreign policy. I'm not convinced that we don't already appear to be deliberately irrational in a way that baffles our enemy. Now, whether it achieves the mission is a separate answer. But I think we do that more than we realize. I just think it's not deliberate. And I'm sure Steven asked this question. So I'd be interested in his follow-up.
What is the Geneva Convention on calories per day? That is an interesting question. But okay. Steven's comment is actually, you say depriving players of food as though it's a bad thing. And the question becomes, what's the Geneva Convention on calories per day? For war gamers, it pretty much should be high. There's another question. How do you distinguish between irrational behavior from behavior we don't understand the reasoning for? I'll turn that one over to Justin.
Sure. That's actually something we talked about a little bit yesterday, Mike. And I'm going to argue that in our games, I'm not sure I need to. The challenge there is sometimes our players say that would never happen because they believe they have modeled the adversary incorrectly. And I think I don't care if the adversary is actually acting irrational or they were being rational and the player didn't understand. I'm not sure I'm capable of distinguishing without understanding the thought going into each player's mind. Ed?
Yeah, I think I made a mistake when I first titled this working group. I used the term irrational. I should have probably used the term inexplicable or weird or something. The real underlying intention of that is that I perceive that there is a rationalist assumption within the government and within DoD of a liberal internationalist foreign policy that's sort of a neoconservative kind of foreign policy that says that everybody works as a rational actor and we all try to do the right thing, and we can influence people, we can coerce people. All these kind of concepts come out of that foreign, and I'm not a political scientist, God help me, but nonetheless, it all kind of comes out of that vein. And I said, well, what's happening recently has been the opposite of that, whatever that is. And I called it irrational because I saw the first one as rationalist. I wasn't using the specific economic term or even an intel term or a cognitive term for it. It was rather a reflection of how we as a corporate entity that is DoD think about what we do as opposed to what we actually do, which is quite irrational.
Have we hit? Oh, I was going to say, have we hit time? I don't know what our time limit is here.
I actually don't know either. Mike?
We're good on time.
Okay.
Awesome.
So we have some other questions. I think Mike popped one up. I don't want to answer a question that Mike hasn't popped up. Can we put artificialities into the game as long as it is made known? Yeah, but the minute you say, I'm going to do something wrong, everybody's going to get irritated. I'll turn that back over to Justin now.
Yeah, I've tried at times to do that, and my general take is that in the end, I end up fighting over those artificialities with my player far more than, and it goes back to what do you include and exclude from the game, but I end up fighting with them about that small artificiality more than the big goal that I have for the game. And as I mentioned, we need to get better at this, and it matters because it matters in the real world. But from a game facilitation perspective, I'd love to do that. I just need a better way of not going down that rabbit hole for hours before a game with my players.
Yeah, Rex Brynan has a comment in the chat. He says he's run a full day game in which the refugee players did not get fed unless they secured sources of income or aid. That's a possibility. And you could also potentially give them contaminated water too. So that would certainly reduce their time at the table. And Tracy Johnson also has a comment in the chat, which says Hackmaster has extensive tables for insanity. You could impose one of the RPG, I mean, Call of Cthulhu has similar kind of mechanics. You could impose some of those mechanics onto the players, but then it would become more of a game kind of mechanic. And so I'm not sure, certainly professional players would probably rebel against something like that.
So, yeah, so to follow up on that, there was some interesting discussion in the workshop yesterday that someone pointed out, I think, yeah, I remember who it was, that, you know, some of the problems Ed and I are describing here may be the function, or maybe a function of DoD and national security games that are not necessarily a function of games in the commercial sector, both hobby games and run for things like Fortune 500 companies. So I'm kind of going to turn the question around and throw it back and say, how do we overcome some of our more unique challenges with the professional players that we have in DoD that are adverse to putting some of these things in the game? I think that was an interesting discussion point that we forgot to put on the slide, Ed, that I thought was fascinating yesterday.
Yeah, and I just want to go back and address David's question here because there's a second part of it that makes it better for me to understand. For example, he says, we don't normally put things like sidelining for maintenance, not enough crew members, CAS reps, stuff like that into games for ships. Let's just take ships. We don't say that SPSX is on the DDG is broken. I'm sorry, Tim Munch. This is Tim Munch's question. We don't say that, and I don't do that in my games. And it's to me, those kind of things, particularly for naval vessels and also aircraft, are kind of below the resolution of an operational level game. If I was doing a tactical level game with 5 ships going up against 5 other ships and a few aircraft, then it does matter that the guy's SPSX is down. But if I'm doing a game where I have 100 chips on the table, one guy not working one time, and it's too hard to track and not enough juice for the squeeze for me. So I just want to kind of respond to that less flippantly than I actually did. The next question is, can we put artificial? Oh, okay, that's that question.
The next question is, when is irrationality in a game unacceptable and when is it desired?
Well, it's never desired by professional government players because they always assume everybody's going to behave rationally, at least in my experience. And so they get very irritated when you put it in. Justin?
That good question. And I guess my first response is desired by whom? And then I realized that I've run too many war games. Because someone asked me a question and I respond with a question. It's unacceptable. The flippant answer is it's unacceptable when it ruins my game. And it's desirable when it gets me something that potentially matches real world outcomes and lets me meet the objectives for the game that my sponsor has set. That's really the first answer. Ed, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I in cogitating a little more about it, I really want it in the games because it's realistic. On the other hand, and that's what I've been arguing for here. On the other hand, the sponsors and the players don't want it because it's weird. It doesn't happen all the time. It shouldn't happen. It's like the minute we get AI to actually work, you don't think it's going to deviate from doctrine, do you? Why would it deviate from doctrine? Because we spend all this money to make doctrine, and all these retired guys have come up with a doctrine, and we got to put it in the AI. And so I think that there's this institutional perspective that what I would call irrationality, which ranges from crazy to stupid, doesn't happen, and they don't do that, and that's not what's supposed to happen. And so there's a lot of pushback in the game, and especially with game results. Well, that SPSX went down, and you don't have the maintenance data on that radar, and how do you know it went down? And that was the critical thing through the whole game. Okay, and so things like that happen, and they do through the whole war, but we don't want to have that in our games. And I can kind of sort of understand that because they're looking for institutional answers to institutional questions, but it does make them unrealistic. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that it doesn't make us unrealistic.
So to follow up on that, there was some good discussion yesterday, and I think in a couple different papers, that really laid out, the ideal way to do this so that it is desired from our players is to make them think it's their idea. That sounds really bad, but make them come up with it as an emergent behavior in the game. But if you can predict how your players are going to react given your rule set, et cetera, before the game, my guess is, to steal one of the things I've heard Ed say before, is you're probably working on Wall Street, making a lot of money, not working in game design for DoD. But that's the ideal. So a different answer: when is it unacceptable? When is it desired? I think if I'm a player, it's desired when it's my idea. And it's unacceptable when it's imposed upon me in a way that seems obvious. And so to go back to next steps, how do we do that? It's game design, but either clever mechanics or emotional buy-in or something. And I know I've tried multiple ways in DoD gaming, and it doesn't always work. And if you've got a panacea, I'd love to hear it. And you should write a paper for us too.
Yeah, you should write a paper for us. The Evan in the chat says the number of different methods he's seen to model Trump in the last few years makes him think that Trump has inspired some of the greatest wealth of new game mechanics on irrationality. I personally have not seen those, but I will tell you it's harder than I think everybody may expect it is. I actually had an opportunity to sort of work on developing a game for the during the election as to how to react to Trump, and before he became president, the Hillary election. And the first and only major question was, how do we simulate Trump? Do you get somebody who knows him? and can behave like him. I don't just need random decisions. I need his decisions. I need his decision-making logic. And even though it's very irrational, very not, but by my terms of irrational, meaning not the corporatist leftist, the corporatist liberal sort of neoconservative, conservative kind of corporatist tradition that we have in the U.S. And because it's not that, it's very hard to simulate. And the people who would be simulating would essentially be engaging in histrionics, and everybody would be going like, "You're crazy," and it's a very tricky thing to try to do in games. I think the way to do it is either make it a committee or have it prescripted or try to have it avoid it somehow, which is very difficult. I just don't think there's an easy answer here, which is why I posed the question for the entire working group. So, Justin, if you...
No, I agree. I see we have another question. Can adding or allowing irrationality in a game increase or decrease player interest in the game? So I'll take a shot at that. I know when I play hobby games, adding a little bit actually increases my interest. The challenge is that my audience that I'm working with day to day, I would hazard a guess that it decreases their interest, and to go back to my previous answer, decreases their interest unless I do it in a very clever way. That they don't realize that I am being deliberately irrational. I don't know how to say it other than that. So Ed, I'm interested if you have more thoughts on that.
I think it certainly can amuse the players. And by that sense, they will become more engaged in the game because, again, it's both more real and more hilarious. And of course, it depends on exactly what you're doing. But it does create, and I think this is an important game design principle in general. It does create this sense of tension in the game within the narrative, that if the players don't fully predict or are able to predict where the narrative is going to go, then the players see that as much more realistic. Because in the real world, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. And so if you're creative with it, I think it can increase, as you say, player interest in the game, but mainly from an engagement standpoint. They become more engaged with the narrative of the game. For that reason, I think, again, going to my definition of irrationality, not just some sort of economic definition of not following self-interest. I think it creates a lot of opportunities in the game to have events and things that entrance and enhance the player experience. And so, yeah, I think it does. Rex says he simulated it in the chat. He simulated it 3 times. One was by a U.S. political journalist, and the political journalist pretty much got it right in the November 2020 to January 2021 post-election behavior. There are ways to do this, and the political journalist was probably the most logical. But in a game that you want people to take it seriously, you gotta really hit the right note, which apparently Rex did, because Rex is an amazing designer.
Looking to see, do we have any other questions?
Robert Mosier's also said that in the NSDM, which is National Security Decision Making game, that he was apparently involved in, he argued that you couldn't model Trump because of that sort of unpredictability, which I think I just think it's hard. I think, it's a hard design problem. There are easy design problems. What's the combat strength of a Marine Corps platoon? That's relatively easy compared to how does Trump think? And so it's a harder design problem.
Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, I'm going to continue to say you should join the discussion that we hope to continue after this, because I'm very interested in how we might get after this. And I'm surprised, Ed, you haven't brought up, like, can we use social deduction games or something? Because I think I've heard you say that during the conference.
Yeah, well, I think social deduction games are a possible path for some of this, but I think that the topic is so broad in general that one particular mechanic is not going to necessarily solve all of our problems. I think, just like everything, the first step is to recognize you have a problem, um, and I think the zeroth order solution to a lot of this is you get people that have had those jobs to play those jobs, just like what Rex did with a journalist. People that understand the human element involved play those things. If I was doing Congress, I've worked this many times with Congress. You get retired congressmen. They're usually looking for a job, and there's a lot of them. So you get the retired congressman to come in and play, and that works out quite well. And because they understand how the institution works. I think the bigger challenge is not how to simulate this stuff. The bigger challenge is to get people to accept its simulation in games. I think, pinning, which is my number one way of including this in games, for tactical games where you have fire and fire suppresses movement and counterfire. Pinning is a classic example of something that's pretty easily accepted. Guys understand that when they're shooting at you, you're going to put your head down. So pinning units is pretty easily understood. The whole concept of what becomes combat ineffective and combat effective and how you deal with that, which is the modern version of saying panic or morale, is another whole story. And in particular for modern peer competitor units, the idea of running away is not a question. The question becomes, are they combat effective? Because they're not going to run away. And so that's an interesting distinction. But on the other hand, other units from some countries might very well run away or disappear or disperse. So, yeah. Justin?
I have nothing else at this point, Ed.
Okay.
I don't see any more questions or comments. So do you have any closing thought? Any other closing thoughts before I think we call it a Friday?
No, I just wanted to say we both really appreciate everybody who worked in this working group. We've got some good papers coming out of it, I think. And I think we're going to have a good proceedings from it. And we had certainly a great discussion in the jam and the concept board. I keep calling it jam board. The concept board worked really well to allow us to have that discussion. So I think all in all, my summary of the working group 3 is we had participation. We had a pretty good time. We talked about an important topic. I think that this topic is worth thinking about as war game designers. And we're going to come out with some sort of proceedings at some time. So that's working group 3. Yeah. Connections 2021.
Mike Dunn, anything you need to add here?
No, I think we are good. Gentlemen, on behalf of the Connections US 21 conference from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, we do thank you for the working group.
Thanks, Mike.